So we'll get started with our next talk, last talk of today. Nobre is talking about anticipating perception.
Thanks, Alex. I'd like to really thank the organizers for inviting me to be here. This is a really new experience for me, and I was wondering how it came about that I was here, and I thought, well, maybe it was all predetermined and there was no other alternative. And then I realized maybe it's because I'm a quarter Amazonian, so who knows, I have Amazonian grandma, not from the Amondawa tribe though. But more seriously, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I work on perception and on the highly selective and adaptable nature of our perception and cognition. And I was thinking about what I could bring to this room that might be of interest to people working on the nature of time and the possibility of the present moment in time having any important relevance, even if it has no sort of more important relevance than just a passage through of assimilating the world on a way through, then hopefully I can help break down some more intuitions in you about how our interface with the world is not as intuitive as we often like to think. Although I realize you guys are a highly non-intuitive bunch, so it might not be such a hard sell as it normally is when I speak to non-physicists or non-philosophers. Okay, so I'll see how it goes. I kind of put a few things together, and I can sort of gauge the time, and also it's a little bit modular, so I can chuck some things if people start passing out or vomiting or something halfway through, so we'll see. Okay, so for those intuitive folk, maybe not like yourselves, we have this notion that, you know, we perceive everything that's out there at this given moment in time, that everything is accessible to us in a continuous spatial and sort of temporal flow, and that maybe perception is there for our musing to some extent. But we cognitive neuroscientists tend to think of perception instead as actually a mechanism for adapting our behavior, sometimes purposefully. And we have come to learn that perception is not at all veridical, it's not complete, and it's not reactive. So it's not like the brain is sitting there waiting and signals are coming in and getting integrated in and processed in and forming a picture of what's going on for our musings. Instead, I hope to convince you today that our perception is highly, highly selective. It's very much determined by our ongoing task goals. It's proactive, and to a large extent it's predictive. It's forward-looking, it's future-looking. And the domain in cognitive neuroscience and psychology that considers this selectivization of perception is the domain of selective attention, or sometimes shorthanded to attention. And I would argue that this is the set of functions by which we prioritize events in order to process things that are relevant to our goals and to our motivational states, and discard the irrelevant items and distracting items. And one of the most interesting aspects, I think, to me in selective attention is, which I'll demonstrate to you, this prevalence of these anticipatory biasing signals that are preparing the brain to take in information in a way that will enable you to set those correct priorities in a proactive and dynamically changing way. Okay, so I'm going to do something a little bit cheesy, and I'll give you a little bit of a video. Some of you may have experienced some of these examples before, but for those of you who don't know, just kind of remind you of the illusion of our perception. So hopefully this will work. I don't know if there's sound here.
Illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball.
So count just the white players passing the ball. Oh no. That's brilliant. Okay. Time, yeah. Okay. So, I don't know if anyone noticed anything funny going on there. We did load this up before. Okay. So I'm going to skip this because we've kind of ruined one punchline here, but we haven't ruined all the punchlines, maybe. I don't know if it...
The correct answer is 16 passes.
Okay.
Did you spot the gorilla?
The computer spotted the gorilla for us.
For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold.
Can't see the curtain change here. I can see it on that is amazing. Okay.
When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
Okay, so this is the lesson, never use a...
And that's the monkey business illusion.
Okay, and there...
Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at the...
And buy his book, and etc. Okay. Uh-oh, I've lost my talk now. Sorry, this is... Okay, we won't try the other ones, but I've listed a bunch of other flickering examples of inattentional blindness and change blindness that you can have a look at, or you can go to Kevin O'Regan's or Dan Simon's lab, and they have lots of examples like that. So if this had worked, we would have seen that, even if we were actually the expectation of the gorilla, and some of you actually will also feed into the rest of the talk, but also this idea that things that we don't know about and we're not expecting and are not relevant to us go very often completely unnoticed, and actually, I would argue, very largely unprocessed by the brain. Okay. So in psychology and cognitive neuroscience and in the field of attention, we always start off saying, there's so much going on there, we can't possibly take everything, and our perceptual apparatus is limited. And sometimes people say that we don't have enough resources to deal with all the information. I always find that like a really fuzzy concept. And I think there are some limitations in terms of what the brain can extract from the world and what it can put together that actually determined what our limitations in our perception are. And these are, I'm going to try to sort of spell out to you what I believe they are. So this is just a diagram of a primate monkey brain. And it's just meant to illustrate in different colors here that we have lots of different functionally specialized areas that get inputs from different constellation of areas, have outputs to different areas, and all of these areas highlighted here happen to be areas which are processing visual information. And as you move in from the earliest stages of information processing in vision, so like first primary visual cortical visual area onto later on, what happens is that cells are sensitive to different aspects of the environment, and initially they're sensitive to very, very simple things like points of light. In primary visual cortex, for example, they may be sensitive to different points of color or to small oriented bars. And as these cells then impinge on others, they kind of create increasingly complex receptive fields. So you have areas, for example, that sense motion flow, and as these receptive fields get more complex, they also get larger and larger. So like at the extreme, for example, of primary visual areas in a primate, for example, you have cells sometimes which are sensitive to things happening on a whole side of the world, one hemifield, and that actually respond to some quite complex combinations of stimuli, like, for example, complex shapes. But the interesting point here is, like, if this cell were to be emitting its signals, if it's firing action potentials, you don't actually know what this cell is signaling because there's all these different things impinging upon it. And it turns out that the perception is a highly competitive process through which all the different material impinging on the neurons are competing to drive the representations and to be represented in the system, and therefore to ultimately be integrated with other senses, to be combined with the relevant action circuits, etc. And so what happens is we have this severely competitive system going on, and it's going on across many, many different areas at the same time. This is actually a very old-fashioned diagram by Vanessa, and it's much more complicated by now, but it's illustrating a number of all the different visual areas, and these numbers are increasing, and the then known, this is like 20 years ago, connections among them. So the idea is you parcellate, you take the incoming energy, you parcellate it out into colors and motions and edges and shapes. You throw them into this competition in which you're ultimately trying to integrate the firing of a neuron here with the yellow bits way down in another area with the motion bits. And so putting this all together, or the Humpty Dumpty problem, is known as the binding problem, is very complicated, and it's not at the moment completely understood how it's solved. But one of the main things which we believe helps it along is this idea of selective attention. So if we were able to select and anticipate and nudge along and prioritize only those events that are really relevant to us, we were able to tip the balance so that only, let's say we're interested in the rubber ducky, that only the rubber ducky aspects are selected, and as bits of the rubber ducky are selected through connections among areas that are coding coherent, relevant things, you're able then to integrate the rubber ducky and get rid of all the other stuff and greatly simplify this binding problem in the brain. So I believe that selective attention is one of the main factors that's contributing to enabling the selection and then correct integration of items to the brain, which then ultimately guide our action, occupy our awareness, and come to be coded in our memory. Okay, so what I'm going to try to tell you about today, I want to tell you about two things, but in order to tell you about the two things, I have to give you a little bit of a background of a little bit boring bit first. So I thought that the couple of aspects of selective attention that might be interesting to you are things that I work on. One is how our memories, how our previous experience anticipates what's about to happen in the world and how it shapes our perception. And the other aspect is whether and how we are able to extract regularities or information about the timing of events that are about to unfold, and whether we can adapt our perception to optimize things along this temporal dimension. So before I started that, I'll just kind of try to root you in the sort of classical, canonical textbook type of what we know about selective attention in the brain, and I'll try to do that a little bit sort of shallow and quick way, so I don't lose too many of you along the way. Okay, so the limits of our perception was something that the great Hermann von Helmholtz confronted, the great polymath von Helmholtz, and he actually, I think, ran the first empirical experiment to demonstrate the limits of our perception and to show how we can willfully, voluntarily orient attention in order to deal with bits of the environment that we're interested in at a moment-by-moment basis. So Helmholtz built, I don't have an illustration of it, but he built like a wooden box where he had a sheet of paper with a bunch of letters on it. He built this wooden box, made a little hole so he could put his eye through it. He had some sparks so that it could spark some light. He also built an eye protector so he wouldn't burn his eye out when he did this. And he would hold fixation at the center of this thing and would spark off, and he would realize that at any given time he could not see or remember all the items that were on this piece of paper. But what he did is, by maintaining fixation at a given point over successive sparks, he oriented his attention independently of eye movement to piece together bit by bit of the paper until he was able to reconstitute the whole thing. So this is an example both of the limitation of our perception and how you can control your attention to it. Yes?
How did he know it was independent of eye movement?
Just because he independent of making eye movements, I'll tell you. So he actually held his gaze at a given point, and then he voluntarily decided to attend to this piece, attend to that piece. So he was doing it independently of actually moving his eyes. Okay, so that's a nice example. Nowadays we do much more boring experiments, so we have little things like that, give you a little cue, and then a target appears at either a relevant or irrelevant location, or predicted or unpredicted location. When you do that, you can see that people are much faster to detect the items that occur when they're predicted than unpredicted. They're also more accurate. And we know a lot, but not everything, about the mechanisms through which these kind of cues enhance our perception and how they are controlled in the first place. So we know, for example, if we have someone performing this kind of task and we record electrical activity from their head, and these recordings are called event-related potentials. They're looking at the sum of synaptic potentials across tens of thousands to maybe a million or so neurons that are synchronously active at any given time, because this is a non-invasive recording from a human brain. We can, of course, make specific recordings from inside a brain in some cases, usually not of humans. And when we do these experiments, you can see that the exact identical stimulus, when the person is fixating a given point on the screen, the exact identical stimulus is processed differentially from very early stages according to whether that stimulus is important or unimportant to the person in the context of a task, and whether it's predicted or unpredicted. So this shows that from early perceptual stages of analysis, the same event is dealt with neurally very different. And we know from studies in primates, if we go in and record from individual neurons, that, for example, this is a case of one of those neurons that has very complex receptive fields and is coding, can respond to specific objects. So in this case, if you look at this end part here, this is a situation in which two objects are inside the receptive field of the neuron, always. Both the solid line and the dashed line, the physical stimulation is identical. In the solid line case, the animal's task is to respond to a stimulus which that cell particularly is reactive to. And the cell responds as if only that really good stimulus is in its receptive field. The dashed line case is a case where the animal has to respond to the particular stimulus which that cell really doesn't like. And the cell behaves as if only that stimulus is in the cell, even though the really good stimulus is equally in there and could be driving the cell. So the idea is that the same type of stimulation evokes a very different response within a visual neuron depending on the animal's task. And the other information is pretty much thrown away. And in this case, we actually see beforehand, before any stimulus was presented, that the firing rate or the rate of discharge of a cell is slightly higher if the animal is expecting and knows that it has to respond to that good stimulus than if the animal is expecting to respond to the stimulus that it doesn't like very much, the cell doesn't like.
This is in the visual cortex?
This is in the visual cortex. This is in sort of a higher level visual area, but this happens pretty much throughout different visual cortical areas. Okay? And then there are many more aspects nowadays that people are unveiling. It's not just the filtering out of receptive fields. The discharge of the cells also become more temporally synchronized in the high frequency range. You get lowering of noise. There are all these things which optimize information processing so that the relevant item is processed further along the brain, and the other one is discarded. We also know a bit about where the signals that are controlling this spotlight, let's call it for just a bit oversimplified metaphor, but this spotlight of attention is coming from. And it turns out that areas that are, I'll just put both of these together, areas in the posterior parietal cortex and in the frontal cortex, in addition to lots of subcortical areas, etc., are heavily involved in these controlling signals. And it turns out, very interestingly, that these areas are also areas which are normally involved in making eye movements. So the idea that you have a mental function like attention, which you can move around independently of actually having to make eye movements, nevertheless is organized around or is related to or ancillary to the organizations which enable us to actually make those eye movements in the first place, which actually require a lot of the same computations. You have to code things along multiple visual representational frames. You have to be able to update signals very quickly, and all that computation can be used in the absence of actually making the eye movements. And interestingly, I know we're not interested in space here, we're interested in time, but actually it turns out that we have lots of these spatial circuits from parietal and frontal areas which seem to map out space according to different effector systems. So eye movement systems, space around our hands that we can grasp things, space very close to us so we can move away. So it seems that we have several egocentric frameworks for representing space in the brain, and some of these seem to be used also just to move around attention. And the idea is that these are the source of those signals. They are throwing out these anticipatory biases which change information process and vision, and until very recently there wasn't really any real confirmation that this indeed is the case. And so there are several beautiful studies by Tyrone Moore in macaques, and we've done some studies in humans where we actually can stimulate, for example, the frontal eye fields in humans while at the same time recording responses using those event-related potentials, for example, that I showed you. And we can show changes in visual excitability from stimulating these areas into the visual areas, and we can do lots of control experiments to show that that it's not some other funny thing going on. And also we can have a look sometimes at the bias itself. So I already told you about this one study by Kelazzi where you have the neuron seems to be firing at a differential discharge depending on whether the task is about a good stimulus or about a lousy stimulus for driving that neuron. And recently, we've been able to show this kind of things also in humans using fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. So this doesn't show up very well here, but there are, in these displays here, there's some X's in one case and some O's and X's. And if you just present people with O's and X's, and they're very small, our methods for imaging the human brain cannot resolve like inside a visual area if it's processing an X or an O, but we have small differences in preferences of our measurement units called our voxels, one way or the other. And if we measure those tiny biases one way or the other, we can look at a population code in that area, and we can identify which areas in the brain have a population code which is sensitive to X's and O's, and doing that we can look at lots of visual areas. And we can show, so the idea that was prevalent around, but until quite recently never really shown, is that what happens in attention is when you're in an expectation state before anything is ever happening, but you know the important thing to you is an X or an O, somehow that you can prioritize or push along or nudge up only those X relevant neurons, for example. So we did this, we gave people auditory cues and asked them to, they would have to discriminate an X or have to discriminate an O. There'd be lots of white noise coming in, and these things would appear very dimly at an uncertain point in time. And we only used brain images when there's no stimulus on the screen. There's no X, there's no O, there's nothing. There's just a state of anticipation. And what we can show in that case is that there is an area where the population differentiates between a state of expectation for an X or a state of expectation for an O, and furthermore, this state of expectation correlates with actually seeing that X or seeing that O. So it does seem like we do kind of push up these pre-activate stimuli to resolve this competitive process. Another final bit of the background, another bit of the bias that we can see, which is really very prevalent in human studies of selective attention, is that when you're in a state of anticipation or expectation, or if you cued to one location or the other, what happens is you have this particular signature of frequency activity in the alpha band. So you have this 8 to 12 hertz oscillatory activity in the brain, which is thought to relate to a subcortical area in the thalamus speaking to cortex in a loop. The level of that oscillatory activity goes down at the area of the brain which will be necessary for encoding the task-relevant information. And it's as if this thalamocortical loop is like just a filler or an idling rhythm or an inhibitory cycle, and that gets suppressed so that you can actually process incoming information within the relevant visual areas. And this is one example of ours, but there are many others where we gave people a cue. In this case, the cue said they had to discriminate a little Gabor patch, and they had to say whether it was horizontal or vertical. And there was also a distractor patch presented. And we gave them a cue on a trial-by-trial basis that informed them 100% of the time it'll be on the left, or 80% of the time it'll be on the left, or 60% of the time it'll be on the left. So it's a probabilistic cue. We can see that people's accuracy grows systematically with these probabilities, and we can see that this alpha suppression on the side contralateral to the stimulus, which is actually the side of the brain that's processing the stimulus, also decreases systematically. Okay, so that is just give you a sense that our goals and our expectations, they change our perception. They do this by sort of nudging along and other mechanisms as well, but in an anticipatory way, they prepare the neurons that are sensitive to items that are relevant. This helps resolve the competition during perception and guides, as I said, the integration or binding of item attributes within vision, between vision and other modalities, between multisensory representations and action codes, working memory and memory. And in this process, actually, it seems that a lot of the irrelevant information, things that are out there in the world, really don't go very far in terms of registering themselves in your brain. Okay, so that was the background. So I'm going to tell you about two things. So first of all, most of our experiments, as I said, use very impoverished situations like this, where we use explicit cues that instruct people, oh, important things on the right, or important things on the left, or probably the important thing will be here, or probably it's going to be there. But, you know, in real life, it's not what really happens to us most of the time, although these are increasing things that are beeping and telling us what to do at different times. And also, you know, most of us, luckily, don't usually live in such an impoverished environment with a blank screen in our face. And usually, what actually guides our expectations about relevant things in the world, unless we kind of find out, you know, what the true arrow of the block universe is or something. Usually what we count on is merely our own experience coded in our memories. To the extent that we can extract regularities from the environment, this can actually guide our perception. So let's say you go home, you forgot your keys somewhere, but you know there's some kind of spare key that you leave in your very tidy garage, and you try to look around, and I can't actually see it on this screen, but there's a little key there. And maybe you remember that you always leave the key on this counter. And so what we did is we tried to take this situation and operationalize it and create a task by which we would give people a whole bunch of new arbitrary memories, spatial contextual memories like this, and then test whether these memories that they just formed, brand new memories, whether they actually change the person's subsequent perception, and under what conditions, and how does this work. So we gave people tasks like this. Here's another case. I don't think these keys are seeable here, but there's a. Can anyone see this? I can't see it from the side. It's just too much sunlight here. You need to do this in England, I think. And then here's another one. There's another key there. So, okay. So we gave people a whole bunch of scenes like this. We've run a few experiments of this kind by now, and here's one manipulation that we've done. We've done several different ones. In this case, we give people to search for the little key in the scene, and sometimes the key is present in the scene, sometimes it's absent. They don't know which scenes have keys in them. And the yellow lines are people actually exploring and looking around to try to find the key. By the fifth presentation that we do this, in this case we did about 100 scenes. By the fifth time, the person starts off here. They can see that you can't see it, but there's a little key here, so they go straight there. They say, yep, found the key. In the case where there's no key, they keep searching around. And you can see that over 5 learning blocks, they find a bigger number of keys over the scenes, and they get faster and faster at doing this. And now people are equipped. They have a whole bunch of new memories. And we wanted to know, does this work? Can we use these memories to see whether people's perception improves, and under what conditions? So obviously it works, or else I wouldn't be telling you this. But the really interesting thing is that we thought it might take quite a long time for this to work. in terms of, well, I'll explain you the task first. So what happens is we load up these people with 100 new memories. We actually send them home, say goodbye, thanks, and then come back the next day. And in the next day, we run basically a memory equivalent of that simple Posner task that I showed you, where we flash up a scene. The scene either has a memory association with it in this case, or it doesn't. So here they know where to expect the item. Here they don't know where to expect the relevant item. And then the target just pops up very quickly, or in some cases a foil, a banana pops up and they're not to respond to the banana. So they respond to the key but not to the banana, and the key appears either at a remembered location or at a non-remembered location. So we thought this would work, but we also thought that this would be quite a slow process, that you'd see this thing, you'd say, oh yeah, that's the scene, it must be in the blue item. And stuff. It turns out that this kind of memory mechanism is extremely fast. And it's as fast as any kind of implicit or quick transient flash capturing your attention to a place. It's faster than if you use an arrow cue to direct people's attention to a location. So if you give this scene, for example, just 100 milliseconds lead-in time compared to the target, people are already faster at responding if they have a memory than they don't have a memory for this item. And this is just tested with different lead times. This task is not very good to look at the quality of the perception, just at the speed of reaction time, because the discrimination is very easy. But we also have another version of this task where the whole scene flashes up initially with nothing in it, then it goes away, then it flashes again either with a key in it or not, and then it disappears. So this is a very quick glance, and people then have to say, here, was the key present or absent? And when you do that, you can actually look at accuracies, the probability that people are saying yes when there is a key there compared to when they're saying yes but there wasn't a key there, so they have a false alarm. And when you do that, you can measure the quality of their perception, and you can see that the quality of their perception is higher if they have a correct memory for the item than if they don't have a memory for the item, or if they have a memory of it happening in the wrong place. Okay? So this shows that our memory is actually quite effective at changing the way we perceive as we're entering in. Our perceptual interface with the world is highly dictated by our memory. We can also do some imaging studies and figure out how does this all work. So we've run a couple of MRI studies so far, and what we've shown is in these tasks, these memory cues also engage that same network of parietal frontal areas that I told you about, but in addition, they engage some areas that are specific to coding spatial contextual memories, like the hippocampus. In addition, I'm not going to show you here, you can see pre-activation in visual areas just to the cue scene that has no key in it whatsoever, just has an arbitrary memory association to the left or to the right. And you can see the visual cortex already revved up according to the memory for the location of the item. We can also then record these event-related potentials, which give us a much finer temporal scale of processing to see what's going on. And if we look just at the time of when we present them with the cue, we can see again that alpha desynchronization contralaterally to the location of the expected target. And then when the target does appear, we can see that that target appearance from its earliest response leaves a different impression on the brain depending on whether it was anticipated to be at that remembered location or not. Okay, so that's just an example of how our memories change our perception. So just to say that, past experience in memory is actually a very useful source of predictions about events to unfold. I don't know about future in this context, but and these spatial and contextual memories, they drive these anticipatory biases. They do this really quickly. Within 100 milliseconds, they're already effective. And these biases, in turn, affect the earliest stages of our perceptual processing. So it kind of turns around this idea. We tend to think of memory as a retrospective function of looking back to things, reminiscing or retrodicting things, and suggest that memory is also a forward-looking, highly dynamic and proactive, adaptive mechanism to enhance our perception. And there's lots and lots of different aspects of this that to us are still really interesting to work out, and also very severe implications. For example, people tend to think of memory deficits in people with Alzheimer's and old people as being memory deficits, but they actually have a much larger consequence because they're also meaning that people are also not dealing with things from early perceptual levels as well. Okay, so last bit is about timing and whether we can use regularities or our knowledge about important timings of events to also to enhance our perception. And interestingly, although not surprisingly, so especially from the last couple of days here, selective attention is all about this dynamic optimization of attention, and there is no core aspect of selective attention that actually incorporates timing at all. We have a very sort of static view. We know a lot about spatial attention. We know a lot about how the same kinds of mechanisms that we can use to orient attention in space, we can also use to orient attention to colors or to objects according to the receptive fields and to what the neurons are sensitive to. But timing is not part of any model of selective attention. Maybe now we know why, because timing is really spooky to people. People don't really even know what it is and stuff. So, but as cognitive neuroscientists, we go around sort of quite with very naive intuitions about timing, and this is meant to illustrate some examples of how we clearly have temporal expectations, and we can orient attention and time to events. So, like for example, in music or in a sport, the anticipated moments of certain events are quite clear. And if you look through the neuroscience literature, you can find bits of evidence for tuning of neuronal activity according to temporal regularities and anticipation, but it had not really been sort of a unified field and not brought into the sort of the field of selective attention until quite recently. So we've done this in several ways. We've done it by giving people cues that inform people exactly when a relevant target is likely to happen, by making targets appear in a given context more often at a given time than at another time and playing around with that, by making regular or irregular repeating temporal sequences of events. And we've also done some stuff looking at just periodic or rhythmic timing. And I'll just show you an example using the rhythmic timing example. So here we developed a task where the person is again looking at a computer screen. They'd be fixating somewhere in the center, which I've neglected to put here a fixation point, and a little ball appears at the edge of the screen, and it moves in discrete steps along the screen, and then it apparently disappears behind an occluding band or an occluder, and then it reappears again, and the person has to make a fine discrimination about something when it reappears, like it having a little dot in the middle of it or not. And we can manipulate the temporal or spatial predictability of this trajectory. So in one case, we can make the item jump at a regular temporal interval. So let's say something like every 600 milliseconds, it just jumps dum, 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 on a very regular basis. And it also follows a linear spatial trajectory, so that when it reappears, the person knows exactly where it should reappear and also exactly when. Or we could have a situation where they still have a spatial expectation, but the ball kind of moves erratically in time so that there is no temporal certainty about when it's going to occur. We can have the converse, which is that the ball moves at a rhythmic pace, but it doesn't follow a linear spatial trajectory, and it can reappear anywhere along this occluding band. And finally, we have a situation where you have neither complete spatial nor complete temporal certainty. Obviously, these are both very highly constrained. It's just a matter of degree of predictability in all these cases. And when we do this, it's kind of a trial-by-trial kind of bootstrapping of your spatial and or temporal expectations. You get some subtle effects, but they're very reliable. So people are faster to detect the target whether they have spatial or temporal prediction. They're a bit faster if they have both. And there's no much difference between how much space or time helps you along compared to the situation where you have no temporal expectation.
Is there much variation between various people who are doing these tests? Or are they pretty much
there is variation, but there's also enough consistency for the statistics to pull out effects at the group level. But some people are a little bit more spatial or temporal. Okay, so we were interested in having a look at whether and how these temporal expectations can actually change our perception. And here's something sort of quite puzzling comes along, because everything we know about how attention works is attention works by prioritizing, by heating up those neurons that are coding things that are relevant or predicted to appear that conform with relevant things. But as far as we know in the brain, within this kind of time scale of cognition, like the tens to hundreds of milliseconds, there are no receptive fields for time in the brain. That might be quite interesting. That might be one of the reasons why we're always trying to map on space onto other kinds of scaffolds like, mapping time onto other kinds of scaffolds like space. We don't have temporal receptive field. Maybe we do, but we haven't discovered them. There's lots of temporal dynamics in the brain, but there is no like neuron like, oh yeah, I like 220 milliseconds, or no, I like 170 milliseconds. So we don't have that, whereas we do have that for colors and motions and locations. So how the heck would it work? How could we get timing information to sort of optimize perceptual processing? So it turns out that if you have temporal in vision, it's a little bit different in audition, but in vision, if you have only temporal expectations and you don't have any other kind of certainty, we don't do very well in optimizing information processing very early on, like I showed you for space. So here I'm just going to show you some recordings from from electrodes over visual areas. And in the in the black case is the neutral case. You don't have certainty about space or time. In the red case is where you have temporal certainty. You do start having some effects later on, but the earliest responses are unaffected. And actually, all the responses we should see are here, which is on the contralateral side to where the little ball appears. So we don't really have a very early perceptual modulation. As I told you, this is a very bootstrapping, subtle task. So we do have a spatial effect. It's very small, but you see that when this item appears at a spatially expected location, it gives you a bigger early visual response than otherwise. So, you could argue like, well, we don't have any temporal receptive fields for timing to work on. Actually, one of the things that happens, which I'm not showing you here, is that you do seem to synchronize and anticipate a lot of the motor actions, because actions to be performed. So you have later effects. So you think maybe all the effects just happen later on and you're just more ready for action and you don't actually change the nature of perception itself. But it actually turns out that when you have both the spatial and the temporal expectations combined, you do have this great synergy between these effects. So here's the case where you have both spatial and temporal expectation. And what you see is that once you have temporal information about something else that you can code in a receptive field that you're attending to, you actually boost that attentional effect. You time it to occur just at the right moment in time.
This is kind of obvious, but most graphs I look at, those will all be the same. But you're saying there's no statistics.
Yeah, these are all analyzed.
That looks like a really small difference to me.
Yeah, well, they're small on what scale? Yeah, they're highly reliable and replicatable, and they're statistically, and you can do them through like cluster-based statistics, so that you're not imposing any structure on them and stuff. So these are
Millions of neurons. And millions of neurons.
Yeah, this is also a population level response. Yeah, according. Okay, so. Recently, I wish I had kept the other slide that shows exactly the same thing, but I didn't. But we've rerun the experiment, showed the same thing, which I'm not going to show you. But we actually reran it in a slightly, sort of streamlined way, because we were interested also in looking at that bias occurring in anticipation of the event to occur. So here we have a situation. You always have spatial certainty, and the ball is moving either at a constant pace or arrhythmically. And we replicate all the behavioral effects, the neural effects, which I'm not showing you. But what we were really interested in looking at here is just this time when nothing is happening on the screen. There's like about a second and a half when nothing is happening, and people are just in a spatial temporal expectation mode. They either have temporal certainty or they don't, because the thing had been moving in a regular pace or irregular pace. And remember, I told you that in spatial attention we have this desynchronization of the alpha band activity. So alpha goes down at the expected, when visual stimuli are expected. And here what we see is, this is an illustration of the timings of the event under the occluder. So the ball disappears behind the occluder. Then there's like an invisible jump. Nothing happens, but there would be an invisible jump here. And then here it would reappear again. And this is the modulation of the alpha band activity. And you can see that it actually follows this kind of tempo that's imposed by the rhythmic structure of events that preceded it. Okay? And this is for one rhythm, and then for the other faster pace, it kind of squishes down to sort of a faster pace. So we've been playing around with this. I won't show you very much, but we've now sort of have a simplified task, for example, where, again, you can't really see the stimuli very well, where you have stimuli occur either a regular or kind of irregular rhythm. Now there's always spatial certainty. Everything is foveal, happening right in front of your eyes. And you have these splotches of like Gaussian noise, and occasionally you have embedded within it a gabor that's oriented either rightwards or leftward. And around the appearance of the gabor, all the timings are exactly the same, but it's just happening in the context of a rhythmic or arrhythmic stream. And if we do that, we can see that people's ability to discriminate whether the gabor is oriented to the right or to the left increases. They have a threshold increase as if the gabors themselves appeared at a higher contrast. And also, interestingly, we see this, this is just meant to be different trials aligned and looking at the frequency activity at the pace of stimuli. And here, all the timings are exactly the same. It's just in a context of regular or irregular events. And you can see the alignment of the oscillatory brain activity in the case where you have regular rhythmic versus irregular rhythmic. And it turns out that the exact phase here predicts people's behavior. It predicts this contrast function. It actually does show that this specific alignment has psychophysical perceptual consequences, showing that
What does SOA mean?
it's the interval between stimuli, stimulus onset asynchrony.
Stimulus onset.
Asynchrony. It's just saying, yeah, it's just the distance between one thing onsets and another thing onsets. Yeah, so this is just saying here's the intervals are variable, but then these are all the same. But in the period that we analyze it, it's always the same, so that we don't have any immediate physical differences between the conditions. It's just the temporal expectation or rhythmic temporal context that's changing. Just to show that we are able to extract and organize and tune in and entrain brain activity to the rhythm of events, and they actually build these temporal expectations, which then have real perceptual consequences to how we interface with the world from early perceptual levels. Okay, so that was the end of the last bit of data. So bringing timing into sort of this idea of a highly selective perception and attention, we see that the anticipatory biases we have, they also operate on the timing of events, not just other receptive field properties like locations or features of other kinds. And I didn't go through this with you, but just to tell you that these temporal expectations can be built in many different ways. I showed you some rhythmic sort of temporal expectations, but they can also just be given a cue that informs you this milliseconds or that milliseconds. A hazard function, so embedding things like one block where something is highly likely to happen 500 milliseconds and then very unlikely to happen 1 second and very unlikely to happen at 2 seconds, and another block where those contingencies are changed. You can then just, even though people are in intervals where people are unable to count or probably even don't notice these things, their perception changes according to the temporal probability function of events occurring at the expected predicted times. I also haven't shown you this, but these temporal expectations, they can modulate information processing from many different levels, including when we also have certainty about other elements, early perceptual levels. So they can latch on to like spatial effects to enhance them, but they also have consequences to motor preparation and select motor decisions, etc. Temporal expectations interact with all these other biases, and one of the things that's emerging, or let's say showing up as a potential important candidate, is to look at whether and how natural brain rhythmic activity can entrain to temporal regularities of events that are relevant to us. And it turns out that there are lots of signals out there that are relevant to us which occur with sufficient temporal regularity, so prosody in someone's speech, the rate at which you sample the word through your saccades, the rate of sniffing in rats, all these things that are kind of exploring the environment do occur at the kinds of timings which would enable these kinds of brain rhythms to latch on and change excitability for information processing. And there's still, I think, there are lots of major challenges, but one major challenge is actually trying to identify whether there are any, let's say, specific dedicated sources of temporal information and temporal expectations on the brain, or the extent to which these are just emerging sort of events occurring in a distributed way throughout cortex. So that's kind of still an area of very big contentious debate at the moment. And that's it. Thank you.
Just a very quick comment or question. On the last point, I wonder if you've looked into the neuroscience of music on the issue of both entrainment and expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Len Meyer and recently Plural had this idea that the reason why music works so well is because we have these expectations that get triggered by tension release and all these kinds of things. And I think in that literature as well, they have specific cases where they show that there is entrainment.
Mm-hmm.
And when we hear music, it triggers certain motor responses as well, which is obviously why we dance. Certain thresholds of it has to be sufficiently regular to do it properly.
Yeah.
So, have you looked into this?
Yeah, so I haven't particularly looked into that, but that is an emerging field, and it's kind of fusing with this kind of attention literature at the moment. So first of all, I think, it's kind of you look where the light is usually. So I think most cognitive neuroscientists are and people in attention are very comfortable with vision, but vision is actually the really lousy modality to look at temporal information, and actually audition is much more sensitive and much better. So the music community hasn't quite gotten to looking at some of the neural mechanisms and stuff, but there's absolute convergence of the things. And I think one really interesting challenge is obviously, at least Brazilians are not only, we don't only follow like a monorhythm, right? We can do things in multiple rhythms, and we can extract complex temporal trajectories of things, and how that actually comes about. Neither the music people, which kind of also have concentrated on this tempo kinds of things, or us have really tackled. But that'll be one of the next steps.
Sam?
Yes, this is actually related to this. I mean, I was really interested in the synergy between the spatial and temporal cases, but it looks like audition might be a way where a case where you can pull the spatial stuff apart from the temporal stuff, because you could set up cases where the sound is coming from anywhere, so you can cleave apart those two things.
Yeah.
So get a handle on that temporal.
Yeah, I agree. I think maybe naively, some of us tend sometimes to think that our different sensory modalities are just providing us with, different qualities of the same stuff. They're kind of redundant. But I would actually argue that maybe they are specialized for extracting different types of information, and actually vision is much better at sort of, spatial, in many cases looking at spatial relations and spatial localization and audition for the temporal stuff. I mean, in some cases you might need both of those types of information, but I actually think that the modalities are probably to some extent, there for a reason to extract different things that other modalities can't do very well. So I think you're right, that it may be possible to pull some of these things apart in audition.
I wonder if that's where you might find some of those temporal perception type parts.
Yeah, I've thought about that, and I've started speaking to some of. So one problem with the human work in audition. Okay, it's not a problem, it's a limitation of the methodology. Like the human work looking at auditory cortex, people tend to look at a response in audition, like the earliest cortical response, they tend to look at like this response about 100 milliseconds. And they think that they're looking at a very early stage of audition, but actually in audition you have all these different subcortical relays. So actually by the time you're looking at that, you're already looking at something that's quite late within the auditory stream. So how to push that forward and look at the early auditory processing in humans is a little bit tricky. But I think that would be an important goal, or to move to some animal experimentation to look at that. And in that case, I think there are frequency receptive fields and things which might start giving you the building blocks for some time-related receptive fields.
Carlo?
Two very short questions. The first one is this attention state, this visual perception. What would be your expectation? We share this with mammals, with vertebrates, with anybody who has a neuron, where does it come from?
So, I have colleagues who study this in the fruit fly and bees, but I don't know. They also study awareness in fruit flies and bees. I don't know. I don't know how I agree or disagree with those things. Certainly, in primates and other mammals like rodents, this is a shared thing. So this idea that you have. Yeah. So one thing, for example, just to make one point, though, that I didn't make when I was going through the memory stuff, for example. I mean, obviously, it's inconceivable that you go around and you're like voluntarily projecting all the memories you have to tune things. So a lot of these are highly, probably, although it's very hard to show, they're very automated, implicit processings that are happening all the time. Anyway.
And the second also is very short. Chris was sort of pointing out the conventionality of the forward and back connection with future and past. Would be silly to try to connect it with the fact that, for a lion, the attention is on the zebra, and since our eyes are in front of our head, the zebra is in front of us. So my future is in front of me, and since my food is in front of me, because I'm going to get. So if my attention is toward whatever is relevant for the immediate future, and my attention is towards my eyes, if I had to choose a convention, would it be this is my follow, or am I just delirium?
No, I think no. I don't think. I think it's possible. I mean, it's true that in as much as we know the frequency distribution of these different directionalities of the sagittal axis is that I think far more languages have the future in front and behind. But I have to say that a bit cautiously. And people have motivated this with reference to locomotion.
Locomotion.
But
Which is also related to, it's all, yeah. I mean, you kind of, I did once meet a man who could walk in every direction and see in every direction. He put on a great display of it, which I can't really imitate. But, maybe concentrating, focusing also the receptors and the action foraging mechanisms in one direction is probably just economical. But you said about sort of, how we're kind of seeing and also attending to the future all the time. Actually, a lot of, one of the other sort of things that my work has done to sort of expand this notion of attention is also to demonstrate how we're also able to focus on specific aspects of our memory. We can orient spatial attention, for example, to a memory representation and highlight certain things and prioritize them. So, it also maybe works I don't know whether that's in the present with an old representation in the present or whether that's moving backwards in time. But
Nick,
so I guess this is the memory bonding experiments with the key, where you have the key. So first I got to teach them where the key is, you show them the same picture, so 5 times rings.
Yeah, so we give them about, it depends on the experiment, but anywhere between 100 and 200 scenes. They just shown one at a time on a computer screen, and they just have to look around, and then they click, find it, and then it moves on to the next one, and then the whole thing gets repeated about 5 times.
So my question was, how long does the effect last?
We haven't tested that. So most people who do long-term memory studies, they teach someone something and then they go blah, 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 and then they test it. So we actually at least give people, we send them home, we let them sleep on it, which might turn out to be quite important, and then we do it on 1 or 2 days later. We haven't tested the longevity of it. The problem with this experiment is once you test it once, then you kind of perturb it, so you can't really keep testing it. So it's not it's a pain to run, because you have to have multiple sessions. But I know, from having done the first version of this experiment 7 years ago, I still know where some of those things are, but I'm sure it's not as good as.
So the result sort of seems hard to reconcile with my incredibly naive sort of picture of memory, where the sort of short-term memory which you can access quickly, and long-term memory which you can access and takes longer to access.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like you're doing the second bit in the period where short-term is
Yeah, so
there's
yeah.
some other mechanism.
Yeah, so that's what I said. The mechanism is still to. So, the canonical view of attention is, you get some kind of instruction, you hold that in working memory, that's quite quick, and that helps you like optimize things. And our question is like, is that the only kind of thing that's biasing our perception, or do our long-term experiences bias up? Does our motivational state bias our perception? You can expand that a bit more. So when we show this long-term effect, and we also show that it's so quick, it does suggest that there may be slightly multiple kinds of mechanisms operating within perception. It's not just that, you see this thing, you remember it, you upload it to working memory, and then it has an effect, because it's just too quick for that to happen. So it suggests that it also has some kind, and actually there is machinery from these spatial contextual areas. There is machinery to influence visual cortex without having to go through that whole attentional frontal parietal network. That network still gets online in an imaging task, but why shouldn't it get online? But it might not be necessary for it, and we're trying to test that out by combining these studies with patients with lesions in particular bits of those areas, or stimulating at the same time, and just trying to figure out. But I believe that there are multiple sets of biases operating on all stages of information processing, including quite early perceptual processes all the time.
We want to move to general discussion about various talks in a few minutes, but we'll get a couple more talks with the hands that have been up for a long time. George and then Christoph.
Yeah, a very beautiful talk. Just two comments. Firstly, the tasks which you typically or seem to do in this kind of thing, it's to do with balls and crosses, it's meaningless stuff.
Yeah.
Now the problem is that if you really want to get what attention is about, it's about meaningful stuff.
Yeah.
So it's the same, for instance, with a lot of the literature on reading. People give people meaningless tasks to do. Well, that'll give you some, but it's not telling you about the process of reading. And so, really...
so most of my friends think of me as heretical for not using only gabors and crosses and pluses, and actually giving people a complex scene as a...
But I mean, for instance, you need pictures where there's someone lurking in the dark, or there's
no.
another coming towards you, or stuff like
right.
that.
Yeah, that's true. I think if you want to see... Okay, so it's a bit difficult. I think you're absolutely right that, attention is deployed in terms of meaningful things in our experience extracts meaningful things, but if we want to see how does that get put together, if you take an average person and put that in, because of all the baggage that they have, and that'll add so much variability, so then you just need to, make it more aseptic and clean it up a little bit and be very boring. So, for example, one of the things that I'm really interested in doing is actually a combination of these two last parts of the talk, which I told you about, which is this idea that maybe, we have expectations of things based on our memories, but these expectations also carry a timestamp with them. So, like, I know if I enter this room at some point, this candelabra or something will just crash to the floor at a given time, let's say. So I've had all those associations. So if I want to look for a timestamp of a real 3D environment, I'll never be able to separate what is time from what is that sequence of spatial things that keeps changing. So in order to do that, you actually have to run a really boring thing, which is you give people, like, a context, unmoving, there's no spatial information in it, and then something happens at a given moment in time, and then you can say it's the time, it's not the... So yeah, sometimes you have to make your experiments boring to sort of interpret them.
The related question is how this relates to emotions, the positive and negative emotional tag. And I think that would be quite fun. You had this thing where the balls were coming up mainly on the left.
Yeah.
If you told people they're mainly coming up on the right, but they were actually coming up on the left,
yeah,
then eventually they're going to realize you've tricked them, and then something's going to happen. And
yeah. So yeah, we do kinds of tricky things like that. And so one of the things we've done, for example, it's not so much with emotion yet, but we've done it with reward. So we did the memory experiment, where you're just learning the keys, and then on the final block, on half of them, you get like, this key was worth £1, and you're like, woo, So some of them are worth nothing, some of them are worth some money. Then you send them home, you bring them back, you do the attention task. The reward is completely irrelevant. That reward signal will boost the memory signal, which is boosting the space. So I think the reward associations we have, the emotion, all of those things are influencing the very way we perceive things from the first moment. So
even if they don't get any money,
we're not that stingy to our participants, so we could try that. They don't get any money in the orienting task, so they got the money the day before, which was based on half of the scenes.
They don't get money. They don't.
It's completely irrelevant.
Higher according to finding the more valuable keys, but still they
Yeah.
find the keys that are being stated to be more valuable.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe time for one more question specifically to Tom.
Just two quick ones. In the last set of experiments, what happens if you decrease the interstimulus interval in such a way that you get an appearance of continuous motion? Have you tried that? Does the bias
Yeah,
appear, or?
so this is another one of those things where we make our experiments stilted in order to use the method. So in order for us to analyze the brain activity around things, we have to separate things at just the minimum amount. And so we have done one version of the experiment where we just have, it's an fMRI experiment where you have things happening, continuous motion, and then they disappear behind an annulus, and then they reappear at the right time or the wrong time, earlier or before they predicted. And people are very sensitive to the exact moment at which things should appear, and we can look at brain areas and things. So we didn't look at the attentional effect of that. And we couldn't manipulate space and time orthogonally if we had the smooth motion, so that's why we did it in this kind of...
And the other thing that related to the earlier question about audition, have you tried a cross-modal version of it?
Yeah, we're doing that at the moment. So we have an auditory version of it. We haven't done the brain part, but the auditory version works very well. And other colleagues of mine have done auditory temporal orienting tasks, and they've also done cross-modal. So, and that also works.
So the entrainment looks like...
They haven't done the brain entrainment stuff, but the behavioral advantages are all there.
Okay, so we want to open things up to general discussion. So this afternoon we've heard, let's thank Kay one more time. Yeah, if people want to come up, especially people from the morning, because we have to use our long-term memory to recall that Wayne, Avshalom, and
I know, today was the longest day.
yeah. And this afternoon we heard from Teresa, Chris.
Everyone from the day after. I think that was Jeremy's suggestion yesterday.
So now you have to go there.
Oh, we got, they just finished.
Are they looking for more chairs? Well, we don't have Wayne?
No, it didn't have it, I'm sure.
So, good question. You're waiting for...
Okay, it's just we don't have Wayne. So we just wait a minute until they come back. I need everybody to hear my questions. And I sent you to because I need the psychologist.
That's Spatial. That's Spatial. Oh, right.
What should we ask them?
As in when they have this personal observance.
Okay, so we're now going to open things up for general discussion, and I want to ask the first question. So the question requires an experiment first. Now, I suspect some people will have heard about the background to this, especially the psychologists. So I just want to ask anybody who does know about the background, keep quiet while we do the experiment. The experiment is very simple. So what you've got to imagine is that I tell you we have a meeting on Wednesday next week. Then I get back to you in a hurry and say, the meeting's been moved forward by 1 day. What I want you to do is to write down, or at least remember, which day the meeting is now on. Has everyone got that? Everyone write it down?
Just
You've just got to write down, I tell you the meeting's been moved forward by 1 day. It was on Wednesday, you've just got to write down. We'll get on to the this is just preliminary stuff. We'll get on to the details in a minute. So has everyone written it down? Everyone got it? Good. Okay, so who wrote down Tuesday? Who wrote down Thursday? Okay, that's pretty good. Now, the interesting thing is that English speakers divide pretty much 50-50 on that question. And there's also supposed to be, if I remember this rightly from about 3 years back, there's supposed to be some sort of correlation with personality. So that people who have, I'm not sure if aggressive is the right term, perhaps a more sort of confrontational personality, see it, which way is it? People who have a more confrontational personality, let's see, I'm in the opposite group of writing. So I think people who say Tuesday have the more sort of confrontational personality. People who say Thursday.
That's not true.
Okay, so my question is, which maybe to the psychologist, is this an interesting example of the kind of things we're talking about, especially the quiz?
Why did you write Tuesday?
Why would anyone write? You're a Thursday.
Yeah, so
I
didn't go.
I don't understand the Tuesday perspective.
So
Coming up, Chris mentioned coming up.
He said move it forward.
Sorry?
It's moving forward. It wasn't moved up.
Did he say? He didn't say forward. He said
I say it's been moved forward by 1 day. So apparently, I mean, what it said to correlate is with, I think, pretty much the two conceptions of our relationship to time that Chris described in his talk. One is you see, as it were, you see yourself moving through time. Or you see time coming towards you. Maybe that's one of the
Exactly.
So is there actually data on this? It is divided 50-50 when there aren't regional variations?
I don't know about regional variations.
Yeah, I'm surprised to learn that there are speakers of North American English who don't say Tuesday. This is a revelation.
I'm very surprised any kind of speaker could say Tuesday.
Right.
Completely. I mean, it's just.
Yeah.
So could have a linguistic.
I don't know, but I thought I would ask. I thought I would just double check.
What do you mean?
Yes.
So David's reaction was it was kind of ambiguous.
Yeah.
What if you asked if it had been pushed back one day?
Yeah, well, I tried to say moved because so it would be neutral.
So we should have a test that one too and see if anybody say the opposite to what they said. Push back, but move. I don't say.
Push up.
Is there a difference between moved up and moved forward? You get the same response if you say moved up?
I just said moved.
You said moved forward.
Yeah, it has to be forward. You need that obviously.
But it also, I guess I didn't know about the personality stuff actually, but there's been a lot of stuff. Lera Boroditsky did this actually, and she found that there were both inter-individual differences within language and differences between different languages as well, biases that people have, whether they choose to think of it as the event moving forward towards you, or the event, or you moving, well, actually it's to do with the orientation of the line, whether moving forward is taking it further out or bringing it closer. And this is because of the inherent deixis of or the complexity of this front-back deixis. Because, for example, if I say, and it's all, like if I say he's sitting in front of the computer, right, then you will usually construe that as meaning that the person is sitting facing the computer. Okay. Whereas if I say, Well, she's standing in front of the car. Even if the car is facing away from, from the speaker and hearer, you will normally construe that as or you will more frequently construe it as being on the other side of the car in their path of motion. I think Lara Boroditsky has done, who I think was going to be here at some point. I think she's also looked at things like moving forward, moving the day forward versus moving forward in the line or the queue, you know, where more people will, even people like me who say Tuesday, when it's the date, would construe moving forward in the queue as moving towards the front of the queue.
Maybe we're spatial in our temporal.
Yeah, years ago there was some really nice stuff which really kind of kindled my interest in this kind of thing from a linguist called Clifford Hill, I think, and he looked at different languages, and he found that the Hausa language of Nigeria, even when you have a non-frontal object like a tree, it's easier if I draw it, you know. So, if you have the green one's gone. I want a green one for the tree, but it's gone. Okay, so there's a tree, and there's the speaker, and this is in Hausa, and you ask them where is something in front of the tree. So the Hausa speaker will put it there, Hausa, and the English speaker will put it there, because so for the English speaker, if it's a non-fronted object like a tree, then they'll place it there. But of course, if it's my point was that if it's a car, the English speaker will also put it there, if that's the front of the car, yeah. Whereas if it's if it's a computer, the English speaker will also put it there. I can't. There's the keyboard, yeah. So it's all to do with, and this is something that people have also pointed out, that it's also to do with your engagement with the object, the functional properties of the object, and so on. So space is not just geometric space, it's also interactive space.
Our meeting can only be delayed and not anticipated from Italian, so no way
I guess English speakers would interpret the sentence, he's sitting in front of the computer or he's sitting behind the computer in exactly the same way.
As a car.
No, not with the car.
Yeah, sitting behind the computer sounds weird.
He's sitting on the far side.
Behind the wheel.
I would already sit behind the computer, can't use it.
Yeah, right.
But are you Dutch? Because I think in Dutch it would be after the computer would be in front of it.
Yeah, I just want to ask this question, because I've heard people talking about this before, this kind of foreign back thing, and I've heard them talking about it in such a way that suggests there's something fundamentally different about the way people are representing time here. It suggests that there's some interesting cross-cultural differences about how time is being represented. But I just don't get that intuition. I mean, it seems to me that in both cases you have the spatial metaphor, and say for example I had a metaphor and I said Margaret Thatcher was an ogre or Margaret Thatcher was a dragon. In both cases,
metaphor?
Well, in both cases, I'm actually, they both, I'm referring to different. I use slightly different metaphors, but I'm actually the meaning is broadly similar in both cases. So you wouldn't say I've got different ways of representing Mrs. Thatcher. So I suppose in this special case too, I mean, I'm not saying it's not interesting, but I don't get what's particularly interesting from a sort of representational or conceptual point of view about these specific types of cross-cultural differences.
So here'd be one hypothesis about this case, and it's nothing to do with your conceptualization of time. It's a question of how you locate yourself. So if you think about the meeting next Wednesday, you might place yourself next Wednesday looking towards your current self, in which case moving forward will bring it closer to the current time. Or you might place yourself next Wednesday looking forward in time, in which case bringing it forward will look in the other direction. So it's all about your own location, or how you imagine your own location when you hear it.
A question to Chris, maybe I misunderstood your message. Your message was less about the direction and more about the non-spatial representation of time in some cases.
I mean, I agree with Teresa that we're not talking here about something which we're talking about constrained variation, where you have some little parameters of variation, but the basic mapping from the basic problem of Dijk's, which is that it is on the one hand speaker-centered, and on the other hand, with terms like left and right and in front and behind, can also be object-centered, okay, reference object-centered, and that just kind of immediately almost opens up a logical space of possibilities, and different languages exploit that logical space differently and have different preferences. Now, I think that is interesting because I just find it intrinsically interesting the way in which these preferences are exploited in different languages, and because it tells us something about the limits of variation as well. I mean, this variation is constrained variation, and yeah, well, I think that's enough really. But I agree. We're not talking here about dramatic sort of fundamental differences in cognitive process or orientation. And so if I can then move on to something else, which is to say that I argued very strongly that space-time metaphors of the passage metaphor kind, right, do not seem to be conventionalized in all cultures, contrary to some people's claim. Now, does that mean that I think that space-time mapping, or for that matter, time-space mapping at a cognitive level is non-universal? Actually, no, I don't think so. I actually think this propensity for mapping between space and time in terms of both sequence and duration is something that is almost certainly transcultural. Of course, in order to do that, you have to actually do non-linguistic cognitive tasks to establish that. But I think that the research that we did with the Amondawa shows that because they have, in the first place, they're able to do this task with plates, which is a time-space mapping, and they don't have any problems with that. In the second place, they also don't really have any problems with learning expressions in Portuguese, which are not quite the same. Well, you can say something like the year that's coming or something like that, and they don't have any problems with this. I mean, they may have some problem with exactly what is a year, okay? But the metaphoric structure, they don't have any problem. And we could not have done the research if we did not have bilingual speakers, who we could talk to, and who themselves could talk to the older people who were less bilingual, let's say. And so I think that my approach to variation is this: that I am interested in what variation tells us about the constraints that the human cognitive system imposes on language variation, as well as the variation in itself. And both I think are interesting. So I don't think that that anymore that we think about universals in terms of like huge blocks of everything being the same. But I would add that I think that it's very easy for for psychologists and linguists and anybody who investigates the human mind to fall into the trap of assuming that doing experiments on a single population is actually sufficient to establish a law-like rule across all populations.
And now I've got quite a queue of people. Excellent.
I will anticipate that somebody already said it.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy.
Well, I just wanted to comment. We risk flogging a dead horse about forward, backward, and in front on, because there's so much to discuss. But way back when you first gave us the task, when you mentioned day axis, I was rather with the David Barry Mitchell camp. That there's an exact analogue, which is not to do with either space or this object-centeredness or indexicality, that occurs in these discussions one has with family members about whether New York or London is earlier than the other. Constant need to disambiguate. At a given global time, the clock reading in New York is earlier. For a given event, the sunrise, New York gets it later. So that's nothing to do with indexicality or space or object-centeredness. Of course, it may be relating to my confrontation with personality.
Well, it's ambiguous or passive written.
Yeah.
Okay, Alex.
I was wondering about the cognitive foundations of the ability to reason about time and get beyond just simple associations of sequences. So, when Teresa, you're talking about the sequence of with the bathroom and the pajamas and the brushing the teeth. So there, the child gets a sequence, but it can just be that all they know is what the next thing is, but they have no, and they will, just like a Skinnerian kind of a rat behavioral social learning, they can get to the next node, but that doesn't mean they have any concept of the whole sequence. And then I think that's an idea too about how children learn the alphabet. So they get the sequence, and so then it seems like they've got some foundation towards reasoning about farther versus closer things in time and space. But when can children be able to say that, for example, Q is farther away in the alphabet from M than is O or something? And I'm wondering how much where does that get going, and how much of it relies on something like planning, and how much of it is just sequence, and how do these work together?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think the way you've described it, I think I was actually ascribing to children a little bit more than you're suggesting that I'm ascribing to them. I mean, you're kind of suggesting that they're just expecting a series of reinforcements of some kind to occur at particular points in time. I mean, I think once you use the word framework at all, I think you're kind of introducing something that's a little bit more flexible than that. So I think you're open to the idea that, for example, if a new event was added in, a new event happened tonight in the sequence that didn't happen before, for example, that you'd know where to slot that in terms of the
Wondering how they get there, from zero. What's the progression of stages before they have the ability to? So the first just links to the next node, and then somehow they add something to that.
Well, the honest answer is we don't know developmentally. I mean, I think we know that they form these representations and they. So, how do they get to the point where?
Well, a couple of things came up for how you can get beyond just tokens that refer to specific things towards the continuum, or of course you have just individual items, then you have an order, but there's order where you only know the next thing, you only know what's two later, then you can have greater order, then you can get to a continuum, which I'm not clear with Chris even what thinks about Amazonians have a sense of continuum.
I mean, you might try and run a particular kind of story which I don't think works, which is that you might think that children have these kind of little ordered kind of islands in time, as it were, and really what they have to do is join all of these together, and how they do that is they've just built hierarchically sort of greater structures, as it were, where they they put together the bedtime with lunchtime, and so they start to build up this giant, and that ultimately they get to some kind of unitary scheme that way. I don't think that is going to work as a developmental story here, because it's hard to see how they would ever get something that was sufficiently large to encompass every unique point in time. And in a way, what use that would be to them, because if you think about what these scripts are, the scripts are there for prediction of regular events, okay? And by their very nature, unique points in time, representing points in time as unique, doesn't have that same predictive value. I mean, these are, these particular points in time will not repeat by definition, okay? So I suppose that I can give you a kind of negative answer. They definitely don't get there just by building more complex hierarchical structure, by sticking together the orders of events in which they know. So there is a question then about how they relate the script-like knowledge that they have to what I'm saying that they have about the age of 4, where they have some sort of sense of distance from now, okay? And it may well be that those are entirely separate sort of systems or ways of being oriented in time for children, and there is a point in which they've got no way of integrating those at all. I suspect that to get to even to the distance from now, that some types of social interaction might be important. And I mean, this is a claim that's made in the psycholinguistics literature as well, that it's critically important to have particular types of conversation with other people about time and about other times, and that there's a certain amount of social construction going on there. But to be honest, we don't have definitive developmental answers about how children reach that endpoint at all.
So it's kind of a different bit of from the adult. It's a really surprising finding, which I was thinking I would include in the end, but I'm already stretching people's patience enough. But actually, there's the very well-known task where you get people to learn like a sequence. Like you just have to press a key. You have this key number 1, you press finger number 1. You just do a sequence of 12 things, and you learn that very quickly. And then you mess the sequence around. People get much slower, and then you bring the sequence back. They're fast again. So we did this thing with just timing. So we had 4 intervals, but they didn't know which finger they had to respond. We just had to learn a sequence of 4 intervals over 12 sequence. You do that to people, if they don't know which finger they can press, but the timings are dum, ding, dum, dum, and that's recurring, but they don't know, they never learn. Mess those timings around, they're just as slow.
There's implicit learning, not telling them what
implicit learning, yeah, just they don't learn. As soon as you join a sequence of 12 fingers, 4 fingers up to 12 sequence, and 4 times up to 12 sequences, even though the 2 sequences completely orthogonal, much harder to learn, now the spatial learning is 10 times bigger. So again, it's this idea that it's kind of interesting that unless timing can latch onto something, it doesn't do very much, even in the adult brain, even in these basic learn, and that might be something, maybe quite fundamental about how we can't really cope with representation of time or. So yeah, of course you can do a sequence of times, but usually associated with music or with a pattern or with something else. So just intervals on their own are quite mysterious, and it may be that it actually. So I would have liked to have given you guys a talk of like how does the brain represent time. I think that's so hard to study because as soon as you have a task like that, you don't know if you're looking at attention or working memory or a decision or a response selection. And to tease those things apart from timing is really hard. So that's kind of, I take the cop out and say, how do temporal regularities influence what we can study? Which is a different way of going about it. But I think all these other cognitive things will all interact with what we study. So it's quite tough.
I think there's another interesting thing, which is that, you brought up the question of rhythmicity, which we haven't really talked about, but is relevant for music. And there is some very interesting work on early infancy. In the last 20, 30 years, 40 years, really, there's been a lot of work on mother-infant interaction and what Colwyn Trevathan calls proto-conversation. And interactive rhythm is absolutely fundamental to this. and and it is the timing of the contributions, the timing, turn-taking, and rhythm of the contributions that each partner makes that are crucial to this, and they're crucial for the infant to actually keep engaged. Well, there was just a really beautiful experiment in the 1970s by Trevathan and Murray, which was very simple. They got mothers and infants to interact via a closed-circuit TV on a big screen. So the mother was on TV, a big TV screen. This would be black and white and one of the old-fashioned TVs, but interacting with the infant, and the infant had no problem at all. They interacted, as it were, in the same way that they would do it if the mother was physically in front of them. But they recorded this. They recorded what the mother was doing, and of course they're doing simultaneous recording of both partners. They recorded what the mother was doing, and then replayed that recording to the infant. And in that condition, where it's the infant is perceiving exactly the same actions on the part of the mother, but there is no contingency relationship between the actions of the baby and or movements and actions of the baby, movements and actions of the mother, and things go wrong, and the babies kind of disengage, or in some cases actually get distressed, and yeah, just one other final thing about this in infancy. I'm not sure how much to make of this, and I'm never completely convinced by some of the claims that Trevathan makes. But he claims in any case that actually if you notate these interactions as a musical score, they are actually. It does actually have the same time intervals as you find in orchestral music, for example. And so rhythm perhaps is maybe I would add rhythm to sequence and duration as a fundamental aspect of temporality, which we perceive. And in the case of rhythm, it does seem to be specific. There doesn't seem to be any other species, as far as we know, that has this.
Okay, my watch is conscious of some fundamental aspects of temporality too, unfortunately. And so I think we're going to have to wrap up. I know that some people have exits and all sorts of commitments. So please join me in thanking all of you.